A big movie about the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. It's about time. What is up, everybody? Random Man here, bringing you my extremely late review for Selma, which stars David Oyelowo, Tom Wilkinson, Carmen Ejogo, Tim Roth, and Oprah Winfrey, and is directed by Ava DuVernay. Now, the plot follows the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., played by David Oyelowo, as he tries to secure equal voting rights for everybody in the South in 1965 by holding a huge campaign to march from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama for his vision. Like I've already said before, I am extremely late on this movie, and also, more importantly, I am reviewing this a week after the Oscars, as this movie has been nominated for some and actually won one. But I actually wanted to see this movie for quite a while, and like I mentioned in last week's video on the Oscar nominations and predictions and preferences, I still wanted to see this movie at some point because I was interested in what Dr. King was doing in this time period in history. That's also a pretty dark one. Plus, we've already had a great movie in the past about another civil rights activist, Malcolm X, back in 1992 with Denzel Washington in the lead. So, how does this one turn out for Dr. King? Let's run down the whole thing. David Oyelowo gives such a lively performance as Dr. King. I've only seen him in a few other movies prior to this one, those being Rise of the Planet of the Apes and Interstellar, and I just think that this is an actor who should get more recognition than he actually deserves. He actually deserves a lot of it. And I'm also quite concerned that the Academy didn't give much recognition to this film in the first place, no less for Best Actor for Oyelowo and Best Director for DuVernay, which I'll get to later on. But I think that Oyelowo just dives himself into the role as Dr. King. I believed at times that he really was this very important figure of the 20th century, and for that, I think that this is such an outstanding performance. Other cast members here include Carmen Ejogo as Coretta Scott King, who is, of course, the wife of Dr. King, and she gives such a grounded performance here that it's also very understandable to see what her actions stand for, in that she is both supportive and concerned for her husband, as there are looming threats along the lines of what Dr. King is involved in for the civil rights movement, and that's what makes her performance also very good. The casting choices of Tom Wilkinson as President Lyndon B. Johnson and Tim Roth as Alabama Governor George Wallace are questionable in my eyes, and I think the movie goes in a little bit more in favor of Johnson being portrayed positively, but the performance for George Wallace by Roth is also very good as well, even though, of course, in real life, if you know about George Wallace, he is a complete nutcase. And Johnson, he has been criticized in this movie for being portrayed a little bit too negatively, but I will say that he plays a president here, Wilkinson, I mean, and he has a lot of responsibilities to struggle with being the president and trying to talk down Dr. King about what he can and cannot do, and that's what I do appreciate here. Now, this movie makes a very smart move in focusing on one huge aspect of Dr. King's life. That is, of course, the march from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama. And usually biopics do fall under a negative of trying to focus on too much of one person's life, but this movie is very much centered on one aspect once again. And for that, this also goes into how these characters are portrayed. Now, I already praised some of these performances, but for Dr. King's in particular, he is not portrayed as a very perfect man here. I think that he has a bunch of issues of his own, as well as being very, very much respectable in many ways for what he is trying to do for many people back then. But it also doesn't portray him in a very Jesus-like mode, where he is almighty and powerful and all godlike. He is not. Nobody's perfect, and that also applies to Dr. King. As much of a great man he was, that's what this movie really does very well. This movie's story also shows a very relevant light on what has happened in the past year regarding recent angry protests and a sling of violence that has occurred in 2014. And this makes it a very important watch, not only to show that we are not going to get anywhere if people are just going to be angry and not follow Dr. King's ways, and also why racism still exists. Now, there are many scenes here that are very hard-hitting in the heart. And I think that one scene in particular did make me jump up in my seat very early on in the film and shows how much violence regarding racism is just horrible in general. But when the Bloody Sunday sequence does pop up with the march to Selma to Alabama, it's very hard to watch. Yes, it is very grueling to see all of the violence just splurge on screen, but it also shows what history has done to many people and what has driven people to do this. They want to secure voting rights for everybody, but there are just some people who don't want it to happen. For all that I've been praising with this film, I do have a few problems with it. For one thing, it is a slow burn at times. Some scenes do drag on longer than expected for how things are going to be planned out, where the march is going to happen and what is happening in King's own personal life. And while that didn't bother me too much, I did notice the running time at about 2 hours for this film at times when the movie does slow down. Also, the movie gets very impressionable at times, where to the point where it goes at you trying to pull you in to make you feel a certain way. And I was definitely affected in what scenes did happen. Of course, the Bloody Sunday sequences and a bunch more. But I think that also made the movie a little bit too preachy for its own good. But this is a subject matter that has to be tackled, and I'm glad it didn't go that far in that movie's regard. So I do appreciate that aspect, even though I personally find it a flaw. But all in all, I still find this to be a very good movie on its own merits and for what it is trying to accomplish in the big message of we shall overcome all odds, whether it's racism or whatever, as Dr. King is just one of the most influential figures out there from the past century. And this film does definitely portray that in both a positive and negative light, as he is not a perfect man, of course. I am just very shocked that this movie didn't get much more recognition during award season than it should have gotten. In particular, a Best Actor nomination for Oyelowo and a Best Director nomination for DuVernay, as she directs this movie with such gravitas and just versatility on screen. I will say, though, the two nominations it did get, though, one of them being for Best Picture and the other one for Best Original Song for Glory by John Legend and Common, which it did totally deserve to win, in my opinion, seem to be pity nominations, as this is a movie that is based off of true events, and the Academy does have a tendency to honor those films, but I get why they didn't want to repeat themselves, as the past years have already given Best Picture to a bunch of other movies. And I'll admit, this isn't my first choice to win Best Picture, but I still think it's worth watching. My final verdict for Selma is 4 out of 5 stars. Thank you all, as always, for watching. Be sure to like this video, comment on what you thought of Selma, subscribe to my channel for more, and I'll catch you on the next movie review.